Hi, Audrey. Thank you so much for agreeing to participate with us in the VFA Pioneer Histories project. You want to start just by telling me your name and when and where you were born?
Audrey Denecke, and I was born in Chicago in June 1949.
Tell me a little bit about your family background, where you were raised, and what kind of family background you came from. What was your ethnic background? And
I was actually, the first 3 years of my life, I was raised in Chicago. My parents lived in a 3-flat with my grandparents, and my mother's family comes from Poland primarily. And my father's family is German, Polish, and Irish, and primarily German and Polish. And my dad fought in World War II, and my mom's brother died in World War II in France. And those were important aspects of our life too, my father's military life and family in general.
Right, right. So tell me a little bit about what your life was like before the women's movement.
First of all, I was the oldest of 12 children.
Wow.
So
wow.
my family, a lot of my early life, was also taking care of the younger 6 and helping my mom, and like the older 6 kind of helped with the younger 6.
Wow.
So I had a lot of early parenting experience, like making formula and taking care of babies, etc. And as I was thinking about we lived in the country. We lived in Lake County, Illinois, in the country, which I loved. However, it was quite, it was like a majority white and not very diverse at all in any way. Even in religion, it was Catholic and Protestant. That was about it. So it was positive in many ways, but also kind of limiting in some ways. And one of the stories I remember is my pastor in 7th grade talking to our class. He had a career talk that he did every year, and he offered he had the girls and boys separate, and he offered the girls 3 life paths. The first one was, you can be married, and the purpose of marriage is to have children. Or if you have a vocation, you can enter the religious life. Or if your parents are elderly and sick, you can be single and take care of them. Those were our 3 choices.
Wow.
And women could work, he said, up until they got married, but the choices were either be a nurse or be a teacher at the time. And that really, I had been reading the lives of the saints and all these powerful women, and his kind of view of what was possible really didn't resonate well with me. And my parents were young, and as I got through high school, my parents were young. They didn't need any help. I had a boyfriend in high school who was a few years older than me, a lovely guy. But he wanted to get married, and I was thinking about all those children I was taking care of. I didn't want to go quite back to that. So I said no to marriage, and then I did explore religious life with the Audrey Denecke sisters, who ended up being a golden thread in my career and my activism, actually. But I always thought, I think I want to be married at some point. That didn't happen for me. I'm single, and I have always been single. Not that when they were ready, I wasn't. When I was ready, they weren't. And so after high school, I wanted to go into college, but at that time, there were no government funds for education support. So I ended up just going to community college at night and working as a accounts receivable clerk during the day. That was my job.
You had mentioned a story about when you were about 10 and your grandparents lived on a farm. Do you want to tell us about that?
I was about 10, and I was going on a vacation with my grandparents to friends of theirs who lived in Porter County, Wisconsin. And I loved the farm, and I worked with my grandmother and her friends doing the household tasks as well as the farm duties. But then this was harvest time on the farm, And so all the women gathered in the kitchen, and they were making this amazing meal with kielbasa and potatoes and all kinds of vegetables and homemade bread that they were baking. And the men had been out in the field, and all of a sudden we started to hear them coming back and washing their hands on the basins outside, and the dining room table was just laden with food. And they came in, and I was hungry. We had been up since like dawn, doing work, and I was hungry.
Right.
And I wanted to go into the living room, and dining room, and I started walking that way, and my grandmother pulled me back, and she said, "No, we have to wait." And I was very, very disturbed. I didn't understand that. So all the men came in, they sat down, they started eating, and all of a sudden I started to hear these spoons clinking on cups. And this was the men asking the women to come in and bring coffee or bring me additional platters of food or whatever. And that clinking of the spoon really, really disturbed me. Mm-hmm. And these women that I had really gotten to know and love, in the kitchen, they're fluttering out there with their aprons flying in the wind, taking care of these men. And we're sitting in the kitchen, like, just waiting. And then the men finished, and they had also completed all the food. The food was gone. And so the women had to prepare yet another lesser meal for us, for the rest of us. And it left me with this thought that over time, that if inequality, if somebody doesn't sit at the table, inequality sits there. Oh. And it really unnerved me. Oh. And I kept telling that story to family, and I remember it today.
Yeah, the seat at the table is a great metaphor, but also
true
real experience.
A real experience
right.
for these women. And
right.
apparently it wasn't just at harvest time that this happened. Women never sat at the table with the men.
Yeah.
So that was quite disturbing. And one other story was when I was in high school. Obviously my mom having babies almost every year, a couple of year, sometimes a 2 year in between. And she would get heavy veins during the, her veins would burst. But one time on a Sunday night, we were all sitting in the tiny living room that we all had and watching Bonanza or something like that. And I heard her scream at me, "Audrey, come here," and I ran around the corner into the bathroom, and she's sitting in this tub, empty tub. It was red with her blood. This vein had burst very severely. She asked me to get towels. I ran to get towels. My other sister came in. My mom said, "Call the doctor." This is a time we didn't have cell phones, right?
Right.
The phone was on the wall. And my sister got a hold of the doctor. Doctor said, "Bring her into emergency room." My father wasn't there. I had a license but no car. So eventually we found my father through calling various places, and he had to take her to the emergency room. Wow. And she could have died from the severe loss of blood that she had. But so after having 11 pregnancies, this was her 11th pregnancy. The pill had just been approved by FDA, and so she and my dad talked about it, and they were thinking, okay, after this pregnancy, she would go on the pill. She went and met with the priest in the confessional, and the priest told her no.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, and so those kinds of experiences really stay with a young girl. Yeah. So then. Then I ended up joining a consciousness raising group in 1972, and that was my entry to.
So that's how'd you get involved in the movement? Was through the consciousness raising group. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that was a good experience too, because as I say, the personal is political, and I already had some of my own personal experiences, but they shared. Many of them were married; they were happily married. But they were not satisfied with the options. I mean, think back to the pastor,
Right,
some of them had jobs, but even as married women, but they were passed over for promotion. They didn't get the same pay. So
This was when, around 1972
72,
or so?
around 1971 and 72.
Uh-huh.
And still, that at that time, the women's movement was just getting steam, I think,
Right,
you
right.
would say. So, so I became a lot more aware of the reality out there in the world for women at this point.
Right.
In 1972, you thought it was modern times at the
Right, right.
time.
It was still,
Not
still
quite.
a lot, not so great then.
No.
So then how'd you get involved in now?
I think for the consciousness raising group, somebody was telling us about the Lake County chapter of Now, and I started just going to meetings. And before I knew it, I was, I think I first started as an officer, as a chair of like a secretary. I think it was an officer of the Lake County chapter of Now.
Uh-huh.
And then I became the treasurer, and then I was the chair of what was it? Oh, the rape task force at the time. And it wasn't because I was greedy for power or anything at all.
You were just willing, right?
I was filling in. People were
Right.
leaving, moving on, and they needed to volunteer. And that's the story of movement life, I think. Is
Yeah, those of us who either didn't raised our hand or didn't not raise our hand, got recruited. So yeah.
And there you were, and it was the beginning of a lot of learning.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So tell me about your big experience at a stockholder meeting.
Well, Jane Paxton was our chapter president, and there was a request for a now officer to go with the Audrey Denecke sisters to a special stockholder meeting of a major pharma company in Lake County, and the issue was infant formula and unethical practices of marketing in third world countries. And Jane had a conflict.
Since became like a huge topic,
it did.
Right?
It was.
Yeah.
I think major church groups across the country and social justice groups and legal groups took on that issue, and so stockholder actions were one of the major vehicles we had for addressing social justice issues, and because it was a woman's issue. Of course, the Audrey Denecke, the women, were
Right.
there, but also they wanted Now and Now's clout to be there. And I was told by Jane to just go and accompany the Audrey Denecke sister. And so we're sitting there. I've never been at that time in a major corporate stockholder meeting, and the room was packed with people. It was a huge auditorium. And as we're sitting there, first there was the reports, and then the major stockholders talked, and then there was going to be our time to talk. And as we're sitting there, Adrian said, well, maybe you should look at this before you read it. I said, wait, I looked at her kind of, are you kidding me? And she said, no, the expectation was you were going to read it. So I'm quickly reading through this really well-crafted, because they had sisters in third world countries. So they were gathering facts on the ground, and also in coalition with all these other religious communities and justice groups. So I stood up, I got the microphone, I stood up, and my voice was shaking. My knees were knocking, but within a few minutes I started to think about who I was there for. And it was these women who were these women in third world countries who were convinced by these pharma companies that the infant formula was better than their breast milk and the antibodies of their breast milk. But the problem was, and as I read the statement, we covered the fact that the pharma companies did not provide any education on the use of the formula. There was nothing, things written in English, but not in any of the native languages. But even so, most of the people at that time were not literate even in their own language. So even having that. And then women were trying to extend the use of the formula because they were so expensive that they started to use less of the powder formula than was healthy. and babies were getting sick and weaker. And then also they weren't taught about needing to have water that was pure. And so they're using unsanitary water.
Right, sure.
And really, they're doing the best they can with the resources that they had available to them. And the companies were really at fault for not examining that and making sure that proper sanitation was available, etc. So babies actually died,
Right.
you know.
Wow.
So, and then after I finished my statement, it was very quiet in the room, and the chairman stood up and said that they would take this under advisement, basically, but they did ask to talk to the Adrians after the meeting. They don't want to talk to now. But the Adrians did join with other groups and negotiated to, this was like a multi-year process.
Right, sure, yeah.
And was in all the national headlines at the time.
Yeah, I remember.
It was new to
Yeah.
me, but
Right, yeah.
became quite, and they were successful in changing
Wow.
those.
So that was
those
quite an
records.
experience for somebody young.
I know, I think I was 23, 24, and maybe less. I
Right,
don't know.
right, yeah. So then, what happened to you and now?
Well, I was working as a paraprofessional teacher at the time, and that job dried up. So I was telling Jane Paxton about this, and she had read in Now the newsletter that a new national office was opening in Chicago for Now, National Now, and that they needed a bookkeeper. And she knew I had been in accounts receivable, and really the job was basically accounts receivable. So she got me an interview with Jane Plitt, who is the new executive director at the national office, and I was hired pretty quickly to go there. So I was a bookkeeper first at the national office, and there's much to say about that later, but also within months I was very active in Chicago Now. And that was quite a formative. I mean, Jane Paxton was a wonderful executive director, but when I moved to Now, it was like the big fish becoming a little fish, and really seeing the national movement in practice. And the leaders at the local chapter, first Mary Jean Collins was our executive director, and then was a National Now board member, and Ann Ladke and a number of other leaders who were quite sophisticated, who had been in other kinds of initiatives, change initiatives, and led the chapter in quite a extraordinary way. And many of the issues that were Chicago Now issues became National Now initiatives, and like the Sears Roebuck employment issue and the city of Chicago issue. All of these things became more broadly adopted and became models for other chapters, I think, it would be fair to say.
And what issues were you most interested in or involved in?
At the time, I was really most interested in employment. Became one of my major areas of interest: employment equity, issues of discrimination, equal pay. And so when I was with Now, I became, again, there were vacuums, and they needed somebody to lead a advocate corps at the time. And the job of the advocate corps was to, so as we're talking to Sears, women from Sears started calling the chapter office. And so the advocate corps would then have interviews with these women to find out what was their experiences, how were they being discriminated against. If they were interested in filing charges, we helped them to know how to go about that, as well as collecting data for our own discrimination charges that we were going to make as a chapter. So, then I became the chair of the employment committee, and actually that became a major accomplishment, the whole advocate corps and employment committee work. I also was very interested in the Equal Rights Amendment, of course, and then in later in my career in non-traditional employment opportunities for women.
Uh-huh.
And then I also worked with the Justice Center on poverty and hunger issues. And women were, of course, the largest number of people in poverty,
Right.
and therefore having hunger, lack of food really in their homes. So those were some of the things.
Right. Yeah, that's great.
Some of the issues that I was involved in.
Tell me a little more about your experience on staff for National Now in the office.
Well, I loved being there. Jane Plitt was an amazing leader, so I enjoyed working with her, and she nurtured all of us there. But as time went on, if you want me to go here with this story, Now itself was, what I found is as social change organizations grow, people who have never had power certainly start to want to be more powerful, and there became to be factions within the national organization, which were quite painful for the whole organization, the whole country, really, within all the chapters within Now. And Jane Plitt, who was really extraordinary, she's a woman who, where did she go to school?
Cornell.
Cornell,
Right.
Cornell educated woman,
Right.
She had been a chapter president. She had, prior to coming to the office, she had a lot of corporate experience. And the board, there was a faction on the board who really started to attack her. And I remember reading some board minutes about, really there was no foundation when it came to Karen DeCrow, who was the president, I think, wasn't yet the president, but was a board member. Maybe she was starting to be a president at that time. And when she was asked by the board to give her side of the story, what her complaints were, she and a number of other board members walked out of the room. And so the rest of the board continued to meet and unpack the story and found no cause for any kind of employment action against Jane. So it continued to get worse, this factional fight. And when Karen DeCrow was actually president years later, or around, I don't know, the timing kind of gets confused, but when she became president, I think it was August of 1975, the majority caucus, of which she was a participant.
The so-called majority
caucus, which wasn't the majority, but they had, I really never fully understood their point of view. It was kind of crazy to me. But one of the things that they planned to do was close all the national offices. And there were some budget issues, I think, at the time. It was a big expense to have offices, but we were pretty frugal. Our salaries, et cetera, were very, very minimal. And so her plan was to close all the offices and terminate all the staff. And it was a pretty painful time for us after they won. Not only us in the office, but the whole organization was in chaos. So we, the staff, were sitting there trying to figure out how do we take care of ourselves in this process. And we decided that what we needed to do was to form our own union. Initially, I think we thought maybe we could join another union, like a clerical workers union or something, but nobody wanted us. So I think we were too much of a hot potato for other unions. But so we decided to create our own union called the Organization of Social Change Employees. And I became the president, kind of by default. Again, no one else wanted the job. And we filed charges. First of all, we asked, before we even did the union, we asked Now to work with us, and the only thing they wanted to do was to give us an opportunity to go for new jobs, that they would create a new office on the East Coast. We were all in clerical jobs. We're not going to move across the country for another clerical job, and they knew it. Sure. So we wanted to be protected in the process and take care of ourselves. So I became the president, and we filed charge. We formed our union. We went to the National Labor Relations Board and filed charges against Now for unfair labor practices because we really didn't have a voice in this process. And it was just quite a disturbing process. It became part, once we filed, it was in all the national newspapers, Wall Street Journal, Chicago Tribune, some places in California, all over the country.
Right.
And for me, this was quite painful because I love Now, you know. I had learned a lot from Now. I didn't want to be the face of the opposition. But on the other hand, the majority of the people in our offices were not active in Now. A couple of us in the Chicago office and like a couple in Washington, D.C. They were just women who needed work, needed a job. So, it just was very distressful. And ultimately, Karen DeCrow and Eleanor Smeel did not meet with us ever, and filed some legal papers with the NLRB, and the National Labor Relations Board did not recognize us as a union. So I went on behalf of the staff to the national board meeting. I think it was in Pennsylvania at the time. I can't remember if it was DC or Pennsylvania, and appealed our case to the national board. At the time, they did try to recognize us, but it was too late in the process. So I don't know if there was anything else
Yeah, well, it had to be a pretty painful time.
It was quite a painful time for us. But yet, if we can't stand up for ourselves, you know, we're standing up for women in other situations, other employment situations, so we ourselves deserve that. And we only ended up with a pretty meager 2-week severance package,
Right. Yeah.
which was the basics. And this was an opportunity for Now to demonstrate how
Right.
to treat your staff in times when you're making changes in your organization.
Yeah.
And they failed at that time,
Yeah.
which was painful for us as well.
Yeah. You had to. I'm sure it was painful for
everyone.
all of you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was.
So when you left that job, where'd you go from there?
Well, I was pretty destroyed after leaving that job, and you know, I didn't know if I was what I could do, but I was asked by another Adrian sister. She was a part of a 8th Day Center for Justice, and they had a hunger project, and they needed staff for that. So I went there and I worked there for a couple of years on a range of hunger issues, and it was actually a good fit for me because these were poor women. I grew up in like middle class, lower middle class kind of environment. I connected to their cause, and women are the majority of the poor, and especially women-led households and their children. So it was a healing role to have because I could see results from our actions.
Right.
And I also learned a lot about community organizations in the Chicago area and coalition building at the ground, and we built a strong hunger coalition there. And when the program was spun off, it became food justice programs. The leader of that group actually was among the first to start a food bank in Chicago. So it was one of the first national food banks, and was based in Chicago. So that, and actually through them too, I also did more legislative action. So when I was with Now other people were doing the legislative action. In this role, I was working very closely with a group called FRAC, Food Research Action Center in Washington, D.C. So I learned a lot about legislative action. So every step along my activist path, there was new learning, there was new roles, there was new risk, you know. But so that was a very healing place.
So, I mean, overall, how's your involvement in the movement affected your later life?
I would say I worked in another women's group after the 8th Day Center called Midwest Women's Center, and worked a lot on non-traditional employment issues,
talk a little
etc.
bit about that, what you did there.
Well, at the time, the Women's Bureau Department of Labor was trying to address discrimination for women gaining access to skilled craft jobs. And at the time, there was less than 2% of women in skilled craft jobs. So I'm talking about carpentry and electricians and operating engineers who run the equipment on the roads that you see all the time. And so when I joined there, I worked in coalition with the Women's Bureau and the Chicago Urban League. And what our task was is to help young minority women, 19 to 21, in neighborhoods, mostly the south and west sides of the city of Chicago, to get into really high-paid, high-benefit, skilled craft jobs. And most of them were working at minimum wage jobs, and we were able to really open the door to that. And so I worked for about 5 years on the whole issue of non-traditional employment opportunities for women. We did educational efforts like conferences. We did training for the women to help them with their math skills and with their physical fitness skills to get into like the firefighters union and things like that. I was a producer of a videotape. We wrote a high school curriculum. We did a whole number of things, none of which were part of my experience a little bit before then, but also things that was thrown into, given support, and we were able to accomplish. By the end, we weren't, it wasn't, after 5 years, we had maybe gotten up to 5% of women. But now you can go down the road and see a construction crew,
right.
And not only do you see the flagger as a woman, you see the woman running the big heavy equipment.
Right. Yeah.
Those heavy equipment jobs, those are huge dollar jobs.
Are they?
So,
yeah. Well, things take time.
Yeah, they do.
So, yeah.
So that was exciting as well.
Are you involved as an activist right now?
I more as an individual activist on women's issues. I'm very concerned about the domestic violence arena, so I'm active on that, and I'm always calling on legislation and writing on legislation on women's issues. But I've been, for the last 10 years now, really concerned with environmental issues and conservation issues. So I was part of a group that actually worked to get the Interior Department to create a Wisconsin-Illinois bi-state refuge. And we were successful in 2012. The Hackmatack National Wildlife Refuge was established, and that was another coalition building effort. So one thread of my career is you don't try to do things alone.
Right.
You always do them in coalition with other groups. So now with a refuge, you have to keep buying land and adding to land. It's not like a national park where you have one area, but you're building land, and we have a set footprint that we're trying to create, and we have several thousand acres already. So that's been exciting, and another learning journey.
Right.
And what I brought there, and the other benefit I got from the women's movement, was learning about change. So my career now has been, since I graduated with my master's, and that was actually going back and taking care of myself and getting my bachelor's and my master's.
Right.
My master's is in organization development, so I've been an organization development consultant who works on plan change within organizations, both corporate and nonprofit. And also I've been a coach. After a few years as an organizational development consultant, I went back and was certified as a leader coach. So I'm working with leaders on change as well. Their own personal change, their teams change, their organizations change. So, my life has now become, has been, I guess, that's the golden thread in it, is having a career related to change and making things better.
Right, that's great.
Thank you.
So, anything else that you think we haven't covered that is important to include in your great
I
interview?
think I wanted to talk about this new wave of activists and how impressed I am with them and how exciting it is to see these new activists. My only worry for them is that I think they rely heavily on marches
Right.
and the like, and I hope that they start to see the broader spectrum of ways to create change. And I am writing a memoir
Okay.
on this period of my life, this first decade, actually 13 years of social justice change around women's issues. And I think that's another medium that people should keep in mind, is writing for change, because writing is another powerful tool that we have to write and to influence people and to create change.
Yeah, I think you're right. Memoirs, particularly today, they're popular, but they're meaningful. So,
My idea to do that came from my nieces during the 2016 election cycle, when I found out we didn't have credit till
right.
in the 70s. They didn't know all the things that we fought for. That's all kind of being lost as new generations come around.
Right, exactly.
So they were my inspiration for writing this.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Audrey, thank you so much for your time. This was great.
Thank you. It was really an honor to be interviewed by you, Kathy. Appreciate all your work and remember you as both a national board member and as our Midwest regional coordinator.
Right,
so
I was.
So it's a privilege.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey.